A lonely Apache found a woman chained where the coyotes howled, her wrists raw and bleeding, her spirit nearly broken by men who thought they could own what was never meant to be caged, until she whispered her true name in the darkness. And everything changed.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The Sonoran Desert kept its secrets well, but Dahana had learned to read its whispers like sacred text written in sand and stone. 29 summers had passed since his birth under the blood moon, and for the last 7 of those, he had walked alone through the endless expanse of saguaro and sage, following paths that existed only in memory and instinct. The Apache called him Dahana, which meant he gives advice, though there was no one left to receive his counsel except the wind and the creatures that moved through the twilight hours. This October evening in 1887, the desert air carried an unusual tension, thick with the promise of storm clouds gathering beyond the distant mountains. Dahana moved through the mesquite and ocotillo with the silent grace of one who had learned that survival depended on becoming invisible, on reading the language of shadows and understanding the difference between the natural sounds of the wilderness and those that spoke of human presence. His moccasins made no sound on the rocky ground, and his long black hair, braided with strips of leather and small bones, moved like smoke in the evening breeze. He had been tracking a wounded deer for 3 days, following drops of blood across terrain that would have defeated lesser hunters, when he first heard the sound that did not belong to the desert's evening symphony. It came from the direction of Coyote Canyon, a narrow gorge carved deep into the red rock where the Apache had once conducted ceremonies and where now only the spirits of the ancestors were said to dwell. The sound was metallic, rhythmic, like the rattle of chains against stone, accompanied by something that made Dahana's blood turn cold in his veins. The sound of a woman crying. Coyote Canyon had earned its name from the pact that denned in its deepest recesses, their howls echoing off the narrow walls in haunting harmonies that spoke of ancient hungers and eternal loneliness. It was a place where the Apache had once left offerings to the spirits, where young warriors had gone to seek visions, where the elders had told stories of the time before the white men came with their guns and their diseases and their insatiable hunger for gold. Now it was a place Dahana visited only when the desert's silence became too heavy to bear, when he needed to hear voices other than his own. As he approached the canyon's entrance, the crying grew louder, more desperate, punctuated by the harsh clank of metal against rock. Dahana's hand moved instinctively to the bone-handled knife at his belt, a weapon that had belonged to his grandfather and had tasted the blood of both animals and men. His dark eyes, sharp as obsidian arrowheads, scanned the canyon walls for signs of ambush, for the telltale glint of rifle barrels or the movement of hidden enemies. But there was nothing except the sound of suffering and the growing darkness of the desert night. The woman was chained to a massive boulder that jutted from the canyon wall like a broken tooth, her wrists bound with iron manacles that had been secured with a length of heavy chain wrapped around the stone. She could not have been more than 25, with auburn hair that caught the last rays of sunlight, and skin that had been burned by exposure to the merciless desert sun. Her dress, once fine and probably expensive, was now torn and stained, with blood and dirt, hanging in tatters that barely preserved her modesty. But it was her eyes that made Dahana pause in his approach, eyes the color of deep amber that burned with a fierce intelligence and a rage that had not yet been extinguished by whatever torments had brought her to this place. She looked up as his shadow fell across her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then her voice, hoarse from crying and thirst, cut through the evening air like a blade. "If you're here to finish what they started, just get it over with. I won't beg anymore." Dahana knelt beside her without speaking, his weathered hands moving with surprising gentleness as he examined the manacles that bound her wrists. The iron was new, probably military issue, and the locks were of a type he had seen on the supply wagons, that moved through Apache territory under cavalry escort. But more disturbing than the chains themselves were the wounds they had created. Deep cuts where the metal had bitten into flesh, infected and festering from days of exposure to the desert heat and the constant struggle against her bonds. "White eyes did this," he said finally, his voice carrying the soft accent of one who had learned English as a second language, but spoke it with careful precision. "Soldiers, maybe. Or men who think like soldiers." She watched him work, her amber eyes never leaving his face as he produced a small leather pouch from his belt and began to examine the locks with tools that seemed impossibly delicate for such large hands. "You're Apache," she said, and it was not a question. "I am Dahana of the Chiricahua. I hunt alone in these canyons." He paused in his work to meet her gaze directly. "What is your name, woman of the burning eyes?" For a moment, she was silent, and Dahana could see a war being fought behind those amber depths, a struggle between truth and the habits of deception that had probably kept her alive in whatever hell she had escaped from. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "They called me many things. None of them were my true name. Then what shall I call you while I free you from these chains?" "Nothing," she said, and there was such pain in the word that Dahana felt it like a physical blow. "I am nothing. I am no one. I am whatever men decide I should be." Dahana's hands stilled on the lock, and when he looked at her again, his dark eyes held a depth of understanding that made her breath catch in her throat. "The Apache have a saying," he said quietly. "A person's true name is known only to the spirits and to those who have earned the right to speak it. Until you choose to tell me yours, I will call you Sister of the Coyotes, for they brought me to you with their howling." The lock clicked open with a sound like breaking bones, and the first manacle fell away from her wrist. The woman, who was no longer quite nameless, watched as Dahana began to work on the second lock, her mind struggling to process the gentleness of his touch and the careful way he avoided causing her additional pain. In her experience, men took what they wanted with violence and callousness, but this Apache moved like a healer, like someone who understood that the body's wounds were often less terrible than those carried in the spirit. As the second manacle fell away, the woman collapsed forward, her strength finally giving out after what must have been days of fighting against her bonds. Dahana caught her before she could fall, supporting her weight with arms that were surprisingly strong for their lean appearance. She was lighter than he had expected, as if whatever ordeal had brought her to this place had burned away everything except the essential core of her being. "Water," she whispered, her voice cracking with thirst. "Please, water." Dahana reached for the gourd that hung at his side, a vessel carved from the shell of a plant that grew only in the deepest parts of the desert. The water inside was warm but clean, flavored with the minerals of the hidden springs that he knew how to find in even the most barren landscape. He held the gourd to her lips, supporting her head with his free hand as she drank in small, careful sips. "Slowly," he cautioned. "Too much too fast will make you sick." She nodded, showing a discipline that impressed him. Lesser people would have tried to drain the gourd despite his warning, but she had the self-control of someone who had learned to survive by listening to those who knew more than she did. When she had drunk enough, she leaned back against the boulder, her breathing more regular now, some color returning to her sunburned cheeks. "How long have you been here?" Dahana asked, settling back on his heels as he studied her face in the growing darkness. 3 days, she said, her voice stronger now, maybe 4. "Time moves strangely when you're dying. Who did this to you? And why?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. The woman looked away, her amber eyes focusing on something in the distance that only she could see. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of memories that she clearly wished she could forget. "There was a man," she said slowly. "Colonel Marcus Brennan. He called himself a gentleman, but he was something much worse. He collected things. Beautiful things, rare things.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Things that other men wanted but couldn't have. Dahana waited, understanding that this was a story that needed to be told at its own pace, in its own way. Around them, the desert was settling into its evening rhythm, the first coyotes beginning their mournful chorus from the deeper parts of the canyon. "He bought me," she continued, her voice flat and emotionless, "from men who had no right to sell me, but I ran. I've been running for months, staying ahead of his hunters, his trackers, his soldiers. I thought I had finally gotten far enough away, but they found me again, and brought you here to die, not to die," she said. And for the first time since he had found her, there was something like bitter laughter in her voice. "To wait. They chained me here as bait, you see. They knew that eventually someone would find me, someone who would try to help. And when that someone came, they would have what they really wanted." Dahana felt the hair on the back of his neck rise as the implications of her words sank in. "They are hunting me. They are hunting the Apache who has been killing their supply trains and freeing their prisoners. The one they call the desert ghost. They know you cannot resist helping those who suffer." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant howl of coyotes and the soft whisper of wind through the canyon walls. Dahana rose to his feet, his hand moving to his knife as he scanned the darkening landscape for signs of hidden enemies. But even as he searched for threats, part of his mind was processing what she had told him, fitting the pieces together like a puzzle made of shadow and deception. "How do you know about the desert ghost?" he asked quietly. "Because I was there when they planned this trap. I heard them talking about you, about your weaknesses, about the one thing that would bring you out of hiding." She struggled to sit up straighter, her amber eyes blazing with something that might have been admiration or might have been warning. "They said you were soft, that you could not see suffering without trying to end it. They said it would be your downfall." As if summoned by her words, the first rifle shot cracked across the canyon like thunder, the bullet striking sparks from the rock inches from Dahana's head. He moved with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill, pulling the woman behind the shelter of the boulder as more shots rang out from the canyon walls above them. The muzzle flashes revealed at least 6 positions, carefully chosen to create crossfire patterns that would make escape nearly impossible. "How many?" he asked, his voice calm despite the lead storm that was chipping away at their stone shelter. 12, she replied, her voice equally steady. "Maybe 15. Colonel Brennan doesn't take chances," Dahana smiled, an expression that was both beautiful and terrifying in its complete lack of fear. "Then he does not know the Apache as well as he thinks." The woman watched in fascination. As Dahana seemed to melt into the shadows at the base of the boulder, his form becoming so indistinct that she had to strain her eyes to track his movement. She had heard stories of Apache warriors who could become invisible, who could move through enemy territory like spirits, but she had never seen it with her own eyes. Now, as rifle fire continued to rain down from the canyon walls, she understood why the cavalry spoke of the Apache with a mixture of respect and terror. The first scream echoed off the canyon walls perhaps 10 minutes later, followed by the sound of a body falling from a great height. Then silence, broken only by the nervous whispers of men who had suddenly realized that they were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. The woman pressed herself against the boulder, her heart hammering in her chest as she listened to the deadly game of cat and mouse being played out in the darkness above her. Another shot, this one much closer, followed by the wet sound of a blade finding flesh. More whispers, urgent now, tinged with panic. Someone was calling for retreat, but his voice was cut short by a sound that was part war cry and part death song, a sound that seemed to come from the very stones of the canyon itself. By the time Dahana returned to her side, the shooting had stopped completely. He moved out of the shadows like smoke-given form, his knife clean but his eyes holding the distant look of a man who had just walked through hell and emerged unchanged. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction at having defeated his enemies. There was only the quiet competence of someone who had done what was necessary and was already thinking about what came next. "It is finished," he said simply. "They will not follow us now. All of them, all of them." He knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he examined the wounds on her wrists. "But there will be others. Men like your Colonel Brennan do not give up easily, and they have long memories." She nodded, understanding the implications. "Then I can never stop running. Running is not living," Dahana said quietly. "The Apache have another saying, a person who runs from their shadow will never find the sun." As they prepared to leave the canyon, the woman caught Dahana's arm with fingers that were surprisingly strong despite her ordeal. In the moonlight, her amber eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire that spoke of decisions made and paths chosen. "Before we go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want to tell you something. My true name. Not the one they gave me, not the one they called me, but the one I chose for myself in the darkness when I thought I was going to die." Dahana paused, understanding the significance of what she was offering. Among the Apache, the sharing of one's true name was a sacred act, a bond that could not be broken by distance or time or even death. He inclined his head slightly, showing the respect that such a gift deserved. "I am Ember," she whispered. And in speaking the name, she seemed to transform before his eyes. The broken, defeated woman who had been chained to the boulder was gone, replaced by someone who burned with the fierce light of a flame that had been banked but never extinguished. "I am Ember, and I will not be owned by any man," Dahana smiled. And this time there was nothing terrifying in the expression. "Then come, Ember of the burning spirit. Let us find a place where the fire can grow strong again." As they walked away from Coyote Canyon, the woman who was now truly Ember felt something she had not experienced in years: hope. Behind them, the coyotes had begun to howl again, but now their voices seemed to carry a different message, not of loneliness and hunger, but of freedom and the endless possibilities that lay ahead for those brave enough to claim them. The desert moon cast silver shadows across the landscape as Dahana led Ember through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate in darkness. Yet he moved with the confidence of one who had walked these paths since childhood, his moccasined feet finding purchase on loose scree and navigating around patches of beryl cactus that could cripple the unwary. Ember followed as best she could, her torn dress catching on thorns and her bare feet already bleeding from the sharp rocks, but she made no complaint. She understood that silence meant survival, and survival was something she had learned to value above comfort. They had been walking for nearly 2 hours when Dahana suddenly stopped, his head tilted as if listening to sounds that existed beyond normal hearing. Around them, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional saguaro cactus standing like ancient sentinels against the star-filled sky. To Ember's untrained eye, this place looked identical to the dozens of similar locations they had passed, but she watched as Dahana knelt and placed his palm flat against the earth, as if reading messages written in the very soil. "There is water here," he said quietly, his voice carrying the certainty of absolute knowledge. "My grandfather showed me this place when I was still a boy who thought the desert was empty of life." Ember looked around skeptically, seeing nothing but rocks and sand and the twisted forms of desert plants that seemed more dead than alive. "I don't see any water." "That is because you are looking with eyes that have been taught to see only what is obvious," Dahana replied, beginning to clear away loose stones from what appeared to be a completely unremarkable patch of ground. "The desert keeps its gifts hidden from those who would take them carelessly." As he worked, Ember found herself studying his face in the moonlight, noting the strong lines of his jaw and the way his dark eyes seemed to hold depths that spoke of both great wisdom and terrible pain. He was handsome in the way that desert storms were beautiful, with a kind of wild grace that spoke of untamed spaces and freedoms that civilized men could never understand. But there was something else in his expression, a shadow that seemed to follow him like a second skin. "You have been alone for a long time," she said, and it was not a question. Dahana's hands paused in their work, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure seemed to crack like dried mud in the sun. 7 years, he said finally. Since the soldiers came to our village with their promises of peace and their gifts of poisoned blankets. The bitterness in his voice was like acid eating through metal, and Ember felt her heart clench with recognition. She knew that tone, that particular quality of rage that came from having everything you loved stripped away by the casual cruelty of those who possessed power. "Your family?" "My wife, Ayana. My son, Nalnish. My daughter, Kaya. They died within days of each other, coughing up blood and burning with fever while I watched and could do nothing." His voice had gone flat, emotionless, as if the only way to speak of such things was to drain all feeling from the words. "The white doctor said it was pneumonia, but we knew better. We knew it was murder dressed up as medicine." Ember closed, her eyes feeling the weight of his grief as if it were her own. She had thought her own suffering was the worst the world could offer, but listening to Dahana speak of watching his children die, she understood that there were depths of pain that made her own torments seem almost bearable by comparison. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "The dead do not need apologies," Dahana said, returning to his work with renewed intensity. "They need to be remembered. They need their deaths to mean something." His hands found what they had been searching for, and suddenly water began to seep up through the sand, clear and cold and sweet-smelling. Within minutes, a small pool had formed, no larger than a man's hat, but deep enough to cup water in one's hands. Ember stared at it in amazement, understanding that she was witnessing something that bordered on magic. "How did you know?" she asked. "My grandfather taught me to read the signs. The way certain plants grow, the color of the soil, the direction of the wind. The desert speaks to those who know how to listen." He gestured toward the pool. "Drink, but slowly, and not too much. Your body needs time to remember what it means to be nourished." As they rested beside the hidden spring, sharing strips of jerky from Dahana's pack and sipping water from the miraculous pool, Ember began to tell her story. It came out in fragments at first, like pieces of a broken mirror that reflected different aspects of the same terrible truth. But gradually the full picture emerged. "My name was Alina Vasquez," she said, her voice steady despite the pain that flickered behind her amber eyes. "I was born in Santa Fe, the daughter of a merchant who traded in silver and turquoise. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable, and my father was respected in the community." Dahana listened without interruption, understanding that this was a story that needed to be told completely, without the interruption of questions or comments. Around them, the desert night was filled with the small sounds of nocturnal creatures going about their business. But the two humans sat in a bubble of shared intimacy that made the vast wilderness seem as private as a room. "When I was 17, a man came to our house. Colonel Marcus Brennan, recently retired from the cavalry and looking to establish himself in civilian society. He was handsome, charming, well-educated, and he seemed genuinely interested in me as a person rather than just as a potential bride." Ember's voice took on a bitter edge. "My father was impressed by his military record and his obvious wealth. When the colonel asked permission to court me, Papa practically threw me at him." She paused to take another sip of water, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the gourd to her lips. "The courtship lasted 6 months. He brought me flowers, took me to dinners, introduced me to important people. He was always the perfect gentleman, never pressing for more than a kiss on the hand or a chaperoned walk through the plaza. Everyone said I was the luckiest girl in Santa Fe, but you did not feel lucky," Dahana observed. "I felt trapped," Ember said simply. There was something about him that made my skin crawl, something behind his eyes that reminded me of a snake waiting to strike. But every time I tried to express my concerns, my father would lecture me about being ungrateful, and my mother would remind me that I was already 23 and unlikely to get a better offer. She stood up restlessly, pacing to the edge of their small oasis and staring out into the darkness. The wedding was beautiful. Half of Santa Fe attended, and the other half wished they had been invited. I wore my grandmother's dress and carried flowers from the colonel's own garden. Everyone said I looked radiant. And after the wedding? After the wedding, I learned what Colonel Marcus Brennan really was. Ember's voice dropped to a whisper, and Dahana had to strain to hear her words. He collected things, you see. Beautiful things, rare things. Things that other men wanted but could never have. And I was just another addition to his collection. The silence that followed was heavy with implications that neither of them wanted to speak aloud. Dahana found himself gripping his knife handle so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, and he had to consciously force himself to relax before he could trust his voice to remain steady. How long? He asked. 3 years, Ember said. Her back still turned to him. 3 years of being kept in a beautiful cage, of being displayed at parties like a prized possession, of having my every movement watched and controlled. He never hit me, you understand. He was too smart for that. Instead, he used other methods. Isolation, humiliation, the constant threat of what would happen to my family if I displeased him. Ember turned back to face Dahana, and in the moonlight, he could see tears streaming down her cheeks. But these were not tears of weakness or self-pity. They were tears of rage, of a fury so deep and abiding that it had become part of her very essence. I tried to run once early on, she continued. I made it all the way to the train station before his men caught me. He didn't punish me directly, but the next week my father's store was robbed and my younger brother was beaten so badly that he still walks with a limp. The colonel never said a word about it, but I understood the message, so you stayed. Dahana said, his voice filled with understanding rather than judgment. I stayed and I planned. For 3 years, I watched and listened and learned. I discovered that the colonel's wealth came not just from his military pension, but from a network of illegal activities that stretched from Mexico to Colorado. Gun running, slave trading, claim jumping, murder for hire. He was careful never to get his own hands dirty, but he was the spider at the center of a web that stretched across the entire Southwest. Ember began to pace again, her movements sharp and agitated as the memories flooded back. I also learned that I was not his first wife. There had been others, young women who had mysteriously disappeared after a few years of marriage. The official story was always that they had run off with lovers or died in accidents, but I found evidence that told a different story. Letters, photographs, personal belongings that should have been buried with their owners. He killed them. He killed them when he grew tired of them, when they became inconvenient, or when he found someone new to add to his collection. And I realized that my time was running out. He had been making comments about my age, about how I was losing my bloom, about how there were younger women who might be more suitable for his needs. Dahana stood up, his movements fluid and controlled, despite the anger that was clearly building inside him. So you ran? I ran. I stole money from his safe, took jewelry that I could sell, and left in the middle of the night during a thunderstorm that covered my tracks. I made it to Denver, then to Kansas City, then to San Antonio. For 6 months, I stayed ahead of his hunters, always moving, always looking over my shoulder, always afraid. She sat down heavily beside the spring, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. But you cannot run forever. Eventually, they caught up with me in a boarding house in Tucson. 3 men, professionals, who grabbed me off the street and threw me into a wagon like a sack of grain. They brought me to the canyon and chained me to that rock, not to kill me, but to wait for me, to wait for the desert ghost. They knew that you could not resist helping someone in need, and they planned to use that against you. I was bait, Dahana. Bait in a trap that was meant to destroy you. Dahana was quiet for a long time, processing what Ember had told him. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled mournfully, as if mourning for all the pain that humans inflicted upon each other in their endless quest for power and control. You saved me, he said finally. By warning me about the trap, by telling me how many men were waiting, you saved my life. You saved mine first, Ember replied. And not just from the chains. You gave me back my name, my choice, my power to decide who I want to be. And who do you want to be, Ember of the burning spirit? She looked at him with eyes that blazed with determination. I want to be someone who fights back. Someone who makes them pay for what they've done. Someone who ensures that no other woman has to suffer what I suffered. Dahana nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. The Apache have a word for this kind of justice. Nalnish. It means the settling of accounts. Then that is what I want, Ember said firmly. I want Nalnish. I want to make. Colonel Brennan and all men like him understand that women are not things to be owned and collected and discarded when they become inconvenient. This path you speak of, it is not an easy one, Dahana warned. It means living outside the law, being hunted, having no safe place to rest. It means becoming something that civilized society will never accept. I stopped being civilized the day I realized my husband was planning to murder me, Ember said with a bitter laugh. And I stopped caring about society's acceptance the moment I understood that it would never protect me from men like him. Dahana studied her face in the moonlight, seeing not the broken woman he had rescued from the canyon, but someone who was being forged in the fires of her own rage into something harder and more dangerous than her captors had ever imagined. Then we will walk this path together, he said quietly. But first, you must learn to survive in the desert. And you must learn to fight like an Apache. The rest of the night passed in a blur of instruction and discovery. Dahana began teaching Ember the basics of desert survival, showing her how to identify edible plants, how to find water in seemingly barren landscapes, how to read the signs that warned of dangerous animals or approaching weather. She proved to be a quick learner, with an intelligence that had been sharpened by years of having to navigate the treacherous waters of her marriage. The desert is honest, Dahana explained as he showed her how to weave sandals from yucca fibers to protect her feet. It will kill you if you are careless or stupid, but it will also sustain you if you know how to ask for its gifts respectfully. Unlike people, Ember observed. Unlike most people, Dahana agreed. But there are some who still remember. The old ways who understand that survival depends on cooperation rather than domination. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Ember felt something she had not experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, but a sense of possibility, of doors opening instead of closing, of a future that she might actually want to live in rather than simply endure. What happens now? She asked as they prepared to leave the hidden spring. Now, we disappear, Dahana said, carefully covering the water source so that it would remain hidden from casual discovery. We become ghosts in the desert, spirits that move between the worlds of the living and the dead. And we begin to hunt those who have made themselves our enemies. Ember smiled, and for the first time since her wedding day, it was a smile that held no trace of fear. I think I'm going to like being a ghost. As they walked away from the spring, heading deeper into the vast wilderness that would become their home, neither of them noticed the figure watching from a distant ridge. Colonel Marcus Brennan's best tracker, a half-breed Apache named Samuel Crowdog, lowered his spyglass and smiled coldly. The trap had failed, but the hunt was far from over. 3 weeks had passed since the rescue at Coyote Canyon, and Ember had begun to understand why the Apache called this land sacred. The desert was not the empty wasteland she had once believed it to be, but a living entity that breathed with the rhythms of seasons and storms, that sheltered those who knew how. to listen to its whispers, and destroyed those who tried to conquer it through force. Under Dahana's patient tutelage, she had learned to see water where others saw only sand, to find food where others saw only thorns, to read the stories written in animal tracks and wind patterns. The cave where they had made their temporary home was hidden in a maze of red rock canyons that would have challenged even experienced trackers. Dahana had discovered it years ago during one of his vision quests, a natural chamber carved by ancient waters and expanded by Apache hands into something that was part shelter, part shrine, part fortress. The entrance was concealed behind a curtain of prickly pear cactus, and the interior walls were covered with pictographs that told stories of hunts and battles and ceremonies that had taken place when the world was younger. My people have used this place for 300 years, Dahana explained as he showed Ember how to prepare pemmican from dried meat and wild berries. Warriors came here to fast and pray before going into battle. Women came here to give birth when the villages were threatened. Children came here to learn the old stories from their grandparents. Ember traced one of the pictographs with her finger, a scene that seemed to depict a woman with flowing hair standing beside a man with a bow. What does this one mean? It tells the story of Sky Woman and Earthwalker, two spirits who fell in love despite being from different worlds. She was made of wind and starlight. He was made of stone and soil. They could not touch without destroying each other, but they could not bear to be apart. Dahana's voice carried a note of sadness that made Ember look at him sharply. So they created a third being, made of both their essences, who could walk between the worlds and keep them connected. What happened to them? They loved each other across the void until the end of time, never touching, never separated, always longing. He turned away from the pictograph, his expression unreadable. The Apache believe that all great love stories are tragedies, because anything worth having is worth suffering for. Ember wanted to ask if he was speaking of the ancient legend or of something more personal, but before she could formulate the question, Dahana had moved to the cave mouth and was studying the sky with the intense concentration of someone reading a message written in clouds and wind patterns. "Storm coming," he said quietly. "Big one. We will be trapped here for at least 2 days. How can you tell?" The birds flew south this morning instead of east, the ants are moving their eggs to higher ground. The air tastes of lightning and change. He began checking their supplies of water and food, his movements efficient and purposeful. In the desert, you learn to read the signs or you die. There is no middle ground. As if summoned by Dahana's prediction, the storm struck with the fury of an angry god. Rain fell in sheets that turned the normally dry arroyos into raging torrents, and lightning split the sky with jagged fingers of pure energy. The wind howled through the canyon walls like the voices of all the ghosts that had ever walked this land, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. Inside the cave, protected from the elements by stone walls that had weathered 1,000 such storms, Ember found herself studying Dahana with new eyes. Over the past 3 weeks, he had been unfailingly patient with her questions, gentle with her fears, and protective of her safety. But she had also sensed something held back, a part of himself that he kept locked away behind walls of grief and self-imposed isolation. "Tell me about your wife," she said suddenly, the words coming out before she could stop them. Dahana's hands stilled on the arrow he was fletching, and for a moment, Ember thought he would refuse to answer. Then he set the arrow aside and stared into the small fire that provided their only light in the cave's depths. "Ayana was like sunlight made flesh," he said finally. "She could make flowers grow in barren soil just by singing to them. She could calm wild horses with a touch and angry men with a smile. When she laughed, it sounded like water flowing over stones." "How did you meet her?" "I was 17, full of pride and certainty that I was the greatest warrior the Apache had ever produced. I had just completed my first successful raid against a Mexican supply train, and I was strutting through the village like a peacock, expecting the young women to swoon at my feet. A ghost of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. Ayanna was sitting by the river, weaving baskets with her grandmother. When I approached her, she looked up at me with those dark eyes and said, "I hear you are very brave when fighting men who cannot see you coming. I wonder if you would be as brave facing someone who was looking directly at you," she challenged. "You?" She challenged me to a race. Said if I could beat her from the river to the mesa top, she would consider my suit. If she won, I would have to carry water for her grandmother for a full moon cycle. Dahana's smile became more genuine. I was so confident that I even gave her a head start. She won. She won by 3 full lengths. And I spent the next month carrying water jugs and learning humility from a grandmother who had very definite opinions about young men who thought too highly of themselves. He picked up the arrow again, but his hands moved slowly as if his mind was still lost in the past. By the time my service was complete, I was so in love with Ayanna that I could barely speak in her presence. And somehow, miracle of miracles, she had fallen in love with me too. The storm raged outside, but inside the cave there was a different kind of energy. The crackling tension of 2 people who were beginning to see each other not as protector and protected, but as something more dangerous and wonderful. What would she think of me? Ember asked quietly. She would have loved you, Dahana said without hesitation. She had great compassion for those who suffered and great admiration for those who refused to be broken by their suffering. She would have seen your strength immediately, even when you could not see it yourself. And what would she think of you helping me? Dahana was quiet for a long time, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight like pools of still water. She would have said that the dead cannot live through the living, but the living can honor the dead by choosing to live fully. She would have said that hiding from love is not the same as being faithful to memory. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the desert was apologizing for its previous day's tantrum. Ember woke to find Dahana already up and working, but instead of preparing food or tending to their supplies, he was carefully laying out an assortment of weapons on a flat rock near the cave entrance. "Today you learn to fight," he said without preamble, "not just to survive, but to win. To be the hunter instead of the hunted." Ember looked at the array of knives, throwing stars, and what appeared to be a small bow designed for close-quarters combat. "I've never used weapons before. That is about to change." Dahana picked up a knife with a bone handle, its blade gleaming like captured starlight. "This was my grandfather's knife, and his grandfather's before him. It has tasted the blood of enemies and the meat of deer. It has carved sacred symbols and cut umbilical cords. It is not just a weapon, it is a tool of survival," he placed the knife in her hands, adjusting her grip until she held it properly. "The first lesson is this: a weapon is only as good as the spirit that wields it. You can have the finest blade in the world, but if you hesitate to use it, you will die. You can have the crudest stone knife, but if you strike without mercy or doubt, you will live. I don't know if I can kill someone. You will not know until the moment comes. But I will teach you to be ready for that moment, so that when it arrives, your body will act while your mind is still deciding." He moved behind her, his hands covering hers on the knife handle. "Feel the weight of it. Learn its balance. Understand that it is not separate from you, but an extension of your will." For the next several hours, Dahana put Ember through a rigorous training session that left her muscles aching and her mind spinning with new knowledge. He taught her how to throw a knife with deadly accuracy, how to use a short bow in confined spaces, how to turn everyday objects into weapons. But more importantly, he taught her to think like a warrior, to see every encounter as a chess game where the stakes were life and death. "Your husband's men will underestimate you," he said, as she practiced knife throws against a target he had carved into the cave wall. "They will see a woman, and they will assume weakness. Use that assumption against them. Let them think you are helpless until the moment you strike. Is that how you survived so long against the cavalry? The cavalry thinks like white men, in straight lines and rigid formations. They expect their enemies to fight the same way, with honor and warning and fair play. The Apache learned long ago that honor is a luxury that the dead cannot afford. He demonstrated a particularly vicious combination of moves that would disable an opponent without killing them immediately. We fight to win, not to prove our courage. By the end of the day, Ember had progressed from complete novice to someone who could at least defend herself in a basic encounter. Her throws were becoming more accurate, her movements more fluid, and most importantly, her mindset was shifting from victim to predator. You have good instincts, Dahana observed as she successfully hit the target 3 times in a row. Your body wants to fight, even if your mind has been trained to submit. We just need to teach your mind to listen to your body. That evening, as they sat around their small fire-eating rabbit that Dahana had caught in snares, Ember broached a subject that had been troubling her for days. I want to understand what happened to you in the canyon, she said carefully. How you moved through those men like a ghost. How you killed them all without being seen. It was like watching magic. Dahana poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. It was not magic. It was training. And necessity, and something else. What else? The Apache believe that some warriors can walk between the worlds, that they can step partly into the spirit realm and become invisible to their enemies. It is a gift that comes with a price. What price? The spirit walker can never fully return to the world of the living. Part of him remains forever in the shadow realm, and part of the shadow realm remains forever in him. Dahana's voice had taken on the cadence of someone reciting ancient wisdom. He becomes powerful, but he also becomes isolated. He can touch the living world, but he can never truly belong to it again. Ember stared at him across the fire, understanding dawning in her amber eyes. That's what happened to you when your family died. You became a spirit walker. I became something that was no longer fully human. I could kill without conscience, move without sound, strike without warning. But I could not love without pain, or hope without fear, or live without remembering that everything I touched would eventually turn to dust. And now I am beginning to remember what it felt like to be alive. He looked at her directly, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. You are calling me back from the shadow realm, Ember, but I do not know if I can return completely, or if I should. She reached across the fire and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. Then we'll figure it out together. Ghost Walker and Fire Spirit, learning to be human again, unknown to either of them. Samuel Crow Dog had been watching their cave from a concealed position in the rocks above. The half-breed tracker had lost their trail during the storm, but his Apache blood gave him instincts that his white employers could never understand. He knew that Dahana would seek shelter in a sacred place, and he knew that there were only 3 such places within a day's travel of Coyote Canyon. Crow Dog had found the cave on his second try, and he had been observing its inhabitants for 2 days, learning their routines, studying their weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had sent a coded message to Colonel Brennan via a system of mirror signals that would bring reinforcements within 48 hours, but he was beginning to wonder if he should wait for backup. The woman had changed her rescue. Where? Once she had been soft and helpless, now she moved with the fluid grace of someone learning to be dangerous. And Dahana himself was different too, less ghost-like, more human. The tracker found this development troubling, because a fully human Dahana would be far more dangerous than the half-spirit creature he had been hunting. As he watched Ember practice her knife work in the early morning light, Crow Dog made his decision. He would not wait for reinforcements. He would take them himself tonight, while they slept and dreamed of futures they would never see. It was a risky plan, but Samuel Crow Dog had not survived this long by being cautious. Below in the cave, Dahana suddenly raised his head like a deer scenting danger. His hand moved instinctively to his knife, and his eyes scanned the canyon. Walls with the intensity of a predator sensing another predator nearby. "What is it?" Ember asked, following his gaze. "We are being watched," Dahana said quietly. The hunt begins again. The attack came during the darkest hour before dawn, when the desert held its breath and even the coyotes had fallen silent. Samuel Crow. Dog moved through the shadows like smoke given form, his mixed heritage allowing him to combine the stealth of his Apache ancestors with the ruthless efficiency of white military training. He had painted his face with ash and ochre in the old way, transforming himself into a living embodiment of death, stalking through the red rock canyons. Dahana's eyes snapped open the instant the first pebble was disturbed on the slope above their cave. 7 years of living as a hunted man had honed his senses to supernatural sharpness, and he could feel the presence of another predator in his territory, like a physical weight pressing against his consciousness. He reached out silently and touched Ember's shoulder, feeling her come instantly awake with the controlled alertness of someone who had learned that survival depended on being ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice. "How many?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the cave's perfect silence. "One, but he moves like Apache." Dahana's hand found his grandfather's knife, the bone handle worn smooth by generations of warriors who had faced death with this blade in their hands. "This one is different from the others. He knows our ways, understands how we think." Ember felt her heart rate spike as she recognized the implications. The men who had chained her in Coyote Canyon had been dangerous but predictable, white soldiers and hired guns who relied on superior numbers and firepower to overcome their enemies. But an Apache tracker who had turned against his own people would be infinitely more dangerous, combining intimate knowledge of desert warfare with the desperate cunning of a man who had chosen to serve those who had destroyed his heritage. "The half-breed," she breathed, remembering fragments of conversations she had overheard during her captivity. Colonel Brennan mentioned him. "Samuel Crow Dog. He tracks runaway slaves and escaped prisoners for the army. Then he has made his choice," Dahana said grimly. "And now he will learn the price of betraying the blood of his ancestors." What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the labyrinthine passages of the canyon system. Crow Dog had the advantage of knowing exactly where his quarry was hiding, but Dahana had the greater advantage of knowing every stone and crevice of this sacred ground. He moved through the darkness like a spirit returned from the dead, leading the tracker away from Ember's hiding place and deeper into the maze of rock formations that had sheltered Apache warriors for centuries. The first exchange came when Crow Dog tried to flush his prey into the open with a carefully placed rifle shot that shattered the pre-dawn silence and sent echoes bouncing off the canyon walls like the voices of angry ghosts. But the bullet struck only empty air, and by the time the tracker had relocated his position, Dahana had vanished into the shadows as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole. "You cannot run forever, Desert Ghost," Crow Dog called. Out in Apache, his voice carrying the mocking tone of a man who believed he held all the advantages. "The woman is the key to everything. Give her up, and I will make your death quick and clean." The only answer was the whisper of wind through the rocks and the distant cry of a night bird that might or might not have been made by human lips. Crow Dog cursed under his breath and began to move again, his military training warring with his Apache instincts as he tried to track an enemy who seemed to exist in the spaces between reality and dream. Dahana watched his hunter from a ledge, 30 feet above, studying the way Crow Dog moved, analyzing his strengths and weaknesses like a general preparing for battle. The tracker was skilled, there was no denying that, but he had made the fatal mistake of believing that as white man's weapons and training made him superior to the old ways. He carried his rifle like a talisman, depending on its reach and power to keep him safe. But in these narrow passages where visibility was measured in yards rather than miles, the advantage belonged to the silent blade and the patient heart. As the deadly dance continued through the pre-dawn darkness, Ember found herself in a position she had never expected to experience. Instead of cowering in the cave waiting for men to decide her fate, she was an active participant in the conflict, using the skills Dahana had taught her to move unseen through the canyon system and position herself where she could strike if the opportunity arose. She had painted her face with red clay and charcoal in imitation of the ancient pictographs in their cave, transforming herself into a figure that would have been recognizable to Apache warriors from centuries past. The knife Dahana had given her felt natural in her hand now, no longer an alien tool but an extension of her own will to survive and triumph over those who would cage her spirit. It was while moving through a narrow passage that connected two of the canyon's main chambers that she stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. Hidden behind a screen of desert willow branches was a camp that had obviously been occupied for several days, complete with bedroll, supplies, and most disturbing of all, a collection of personal items that she recognized with sick certainty. Her silver locket, torn from her neck during the initial capture. A lock of her hair, probably cut while she was unconscious. Photographs of her taken during her marriage to Colonel Brennan, showing her in various poses and states of dress. But most chilling of all was a detailed map of the canyon system, marked with observation points and approach routes, annotated with notes about their daily routines and defensive positions. Crow Dog had been watching them for days, learning their habits, studying their weaknesses, preparing for this moment with the patience of a spider waiting for flies to become entangled in its web. The realization that their sanctuary had been compromised, that their most intimate moments had been observed and catalogued by their enemy, filled Ember with a rage that burned hotter than desert fire. She was still staring at the photographs when she heard the soft scrape of leather on stone that announced the tracker's return to his base camp. There was no time to hide, no possibility of retreat, only the stark choice between confrontation and capture. Ember hefted her knife and stepped into the moonlight, her painted face fierce with determination. Samuel Crow Dog froze when he saw her, his rifle halfway to his shoulder, his eyes wide with surprise that quickly transformed into something like admiration. In the moonlight, with her face painted in the old way and her amber eyes blazing with fury, she looked like a warrior goddess stepped down from the ancient legends. "You are not what I expected," he said in English, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect. "The Colonel described you as a helpless victim, but you look like someone who has learned to bite back." "I learned from the best," Ember replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "And I learned that men like you and your colonel are nothing but predators who feed on the weak and helpless, perhaps. But predators survive while their prey becomes food." Crow Dog began to raise his rifle again, but Ember was already moving, her body flowing into the attack pattern that Dahana had drilled into her until it became instinct. The knife flew from her hand with deadly accuracy, striking the tracker in the shoulder and spinning him around just as his finger found the trigger. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the sky, and before Crow Dog could recover his balance, Ember was on him with the fury of a wildcat protecting her cubs. They went down in a tangle of limbs and desperate violence, rolling across the rocky ground as each fought for advantage. Crow Dog was larger and stronger, but Ember fought with the desperate fury of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. She clawed at his eyes, drove her knee into his ribs, used every dirty trick that desperation and training had taught her. The end came suddenly, almost anticlimactically. Crow Dog managed to pin her beneath him, his hands closing around her throat, victory gleaming in his dark eyes. But in focusing on his stranglehold, he had forgotten about the second knife that Dahana had taught her to keep strapped to her thigh. Ember's hand found the handle, drew the blade, and drove it upward between his ribs and into his heart with a precision that would have made her teacher proud. Crow Dog's eyes went wide with shock and something that might have been respect. Blood frothed from his lips as he tried to speak, but the only sound that emerged was a wet gurgle that slowly faded into silence. He slumped forward, his weight pinning Ember beneath him, his life's blood soaking into the desert sand that had witnessed so much violence over the centuries. Dahana found her there 10 minutes later, sitting beside the tracker's body with blood on her hands and a look in her eyes that he recognized from his own mirror. She had crossed the line that separated the innocent from the killers, had taken a life with her own hands, and discovered that the sky did not fall and the earth did not open to swallow her whole. "How do you feel?" he asked gently, kneeling beside her and studying her face in the moonlight. "Different," she said simply. "Like I've been holding my breath for years and can finally breathe again." "Is that wrong?" "No," Dahana said, understanding exactly what she meant. "It means you are no longer a victim. You are a warrior now, and warriors do what must be done to protect what they love." "I killed him," Ember said, her voice wondering rather than horrified. "I actually killed him. And I would do it again without hesitation." "Good. That means you have learned the most important lesson of all. In this world, there are only two kinds of people, those who take what they want by force, and those who are strong enough to stop them." Dahana reached out and gently wiped the blood from her hands with a cloth dampened from his water gourd. "You have chosen which kind you want to be." They spent the rest of the night going through Crow Dog's possessions, learning what they could about Colonel Brennan's plans and resources. The tracker had been meticulous in his record keeping, and his notes painted a picture of a manhunt that was far more extensive and better organized than either of them had imagined. "He has over 30 men looking for us," Ember said, studying a list of names and locations. "Bounty hunters, ex-soldiers, Indian scouts, even some Mexican bandits. There's a $5,000 reward for you, dead or alive. And for you? 10,000, but only if I'm brought back alive and unmarked." Ember's voice was bitter as she read the detailed instructions about her capture and transport. "The colonel has very specific ideas about how his property should be handled." Dahana felt his jaw clench with rage at the casual way the document referred to Ember as an object to be recovered rather than a human being with rights and dignity. "Then we make sure he never gets the chance to collect his property." As dawn broke over the canyon, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson, Dahana and Ember stood together beside the tracker's body and performed a ceremony that was older than the memory of any living Apache. Using Crow Dog's own knife, they each made a small cut on their palms and let their blood mingle, sealing a bond that transcended mere friendship or alliance. "By blood and fire, by earth and sky, by the spirits of our ancestors and the hopes of our children," Dahana chanted in the old language, his voice carrying the weight of ritual and tradition. "We swear to stand together against our enemies, to share our strength and our weaknesses, to live as one spirit in two bodies. By blood and fire, by earth and sky," Ember repeated, her pronunciation careful but her understanding perfect. "We swear to be more than the sum of our parts, to be the storm that destroys those who would cage the wind, to be the fire that burns away the chains of the past." As their blood mingled and dripped onto the desert sand, both of them felt something fundamental shift in the fabric of their relationship. They were no longer rescuer and rescued, teacher and student, protector and protected. They were partners in the truest sense, bound by bonds that went deeper than law or custom or even love. "What happens now?" Ember asked as they prepared to leave the canyon and venture deeper into the desert wasteland that would be their new home. "Now we become what they fear most," Dahana said, shouldering his pack and checking the edge of his knife. "We become the ghost and the fire, the shadow and the flame. We become the nightmare that haunts the dreams of those who think they can own other human beings. And Colonel Brennan? Colonel Brennan will learn that some things should not be hunted, because they have a tendency to turn around and hunt back." Dahana's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. He wanted to collect a beautiful, helpless woman. Instead, he has awakened something that will not rest until he and all men like him are dust in the wind. As they walked away from the canyon, leaving Samuel Crow Dog's body for the scavengers, neither of them looked back. The past was behind them now, buried as surely as the tracker who had died trying to drag them back to it. Ahead lay the vast expanse of the desert, beautiful and terrible and free, waiting to shelter two souls who had finally learned that the only cage that could hold them was the one they built for themselves. That evening, as they made camp in a hidden arroyo 20 miles from the canyon, Ember composed a message that would be delivered to Colonel Brennan by a method that would leave no doubt about its authenticity. Using charcoal and paper taken from Crow Dog supplies, she wrote in her own hand, "Marcus, your tracker is dead. Your money cannot buy what was never for sale. Your power cannot reach what flies beyond your grasp. I am no longer Elena Vasquez, your possession. I am Ember, daughter of fire and wind, and I am coming for you. Sleep well, if you can. The woman who will not be caged." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in Samuel Crow Dog's tobacco pouch, along with his scalp and the silver locket that had once belonged to her old life. Dahana would see that the package reached its destination through channels that would make the colonel understand exactly what kind of enemy he had created. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, but this time the hunters would become the hunted. The package arrived at Colonel Marcus Brennan's hacienda in Santa Fe on a Tuesday morning that would forever be burned into his memory. The ornate mansion, built with money earned from human suffering and decorated with treasures stolen from the dead, had been his sanctuary for 15 years, a place where he could indulge his darkest appetites without fear of discovery or consequence. The walls were lined with photographs of his previous wives, beautiful women who had once graced his arm at social gatherings before disappearing into unmarked graves when their usefulness had expired. Brennan was examining his collection of Apache artifacts stolen from burial sites and battlefields across the Southwest when his butler entered with the leather pouch that would shatter his comfortable world. The colonel's hands trembled as he read Ember's message, not from fear but from a rage so pure and consuming that it seemed to burn the very air around him. "Find Captain Rodriguez," he snarled to his butler, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man who had learned to weaponize his fury. "Tell him to assemble every available man. Cancel all other operations. I want 50 of our best hunters, trackers, and killers ready to ride within the hour." The butler, a thin man named Jameson who had served the colonel for 8 years, and had learned to read his master's moods like a barometer predicting storms, nodded quickly and hurried from the room. He had seen the colonel angry before, but this was different, deeper, more personal. This was the rage of a man who had been challenged by something he had considered his property, and Jameson knew from experience that such challenges always ended in blood within 3 hours. The most dangerous collection of human predators ever assembled in the American Southwest was riding hard toward the desert, their saddlebags loaded with weapons, ammunition, and supplies for an extended campaign. Captain Rodriguez, a former Confederate officer who had made his fortune hunting escaped slaves and deserters, rode at the colonel's right hand, his weathered face set in the grim lines of a man who understood that failure was not an option. "This Apache you're hunting," Rodriguez said as they topped a rise that gave them their first clear view of the vast desert expanse ahead. "My sources say he's the one they call the Desert Ghost, the one who's been picking off supply trains and freeing prisoners for the past 2 years. I don't care if he's the devil himself," Brennan replied, his pale eyes scanning the horizon with the intensity of a hawk searching for prey. "He has something that belongs to me, and I will have it back. No matter how many men it costs, no matter how much blood must be spilled." Dahana and Ember had been tracking the colonel's force for 3 days, staying just beyond the range of their scouts while gathering intelligence about their numbers, weapons, and intentions. The desert that had once been their sanctuary was now a battleground, and they moved through it with the deadly purpose of wolves defending their territory against invaders. 53 men, Ember reported as they crouched behind a ridge, overlooking the colonel's camp, all armed with military rifles, most with experience in Indian fighting. They're organized into 6-man squads with overlapping fields of fire. Professional soldiers, Dahana observed, studying the enemy through a spyglass taken from Samuel Crow Dog's equipment, not the hired rabble we faced before. These men know how to fight Apache warriors. Good, Ember said, her voice carrying a note of anticipation that would have chilled the blood of anyone who had known her in her previous life. Then they'll know enough to be afraid when we start killing them. The transformation that had begun with Crow Dog's death had continued over the past weeks, turning the frightened woman who had been chained in Coyote Canyon into something that was part warrior, part force of nature, part avenging angel. She had learned to move through the desert with the silent grace of a hunting cat, to read tracks and signs like text written in the earth itself, to kill with the cold efficiency of someone who had moved beyond the civilized world's notions of mercy and restraint. There, Dahana pointed to a narrow canyon that cut through the heart of the desert like a wound in the earth. Devil's Throat, the only water source for 50 miles in any direction. They'll have to pass through there if they want to continue the pursuit. And when they do, we'll be waiting. Dahana's smile was sharp as a blade, and twice as dangerous. The Apache have a saying, the desert remembers every drop of blood that has been spilled on its soil. Tomorrow, it will remember 53 more. Devil's Throat was a natural killing ground, a narrow canyon with walls that rose nearly vertical for 200 feet on either side. The only way through was a winding path that forced travelers to move in single file, exposing them to attack from above while providing minimal cover for return fire. Apache warriors had used this location to destroy enemy forces for generations, and now it would serve that purpose once again. Ember positioned herself on the north wall of the canyon, her body painted with ochre and ash to blend with the red rock, her rifle loaded with ammunition that she had crafted herself using techniques Dahana had taught her. She had become deadly accurate with the weapon, able to put a bullet through a man's heart at 300 yards. But more importantly, she had learned to kill without hesitation or remorse. Dahana took position on the south wall, armed with his grandfather's bow and arrows whose points had been dipped in the venom of desert scorpions. He had painted his face with the sacred symbols of the warpath, transforming himself into a living embodiment of Apache fury, a ghost-made flesh who would guide the souls of his enemies into the darkness from which there was no return. The first riders entered the canyon at noon, when the sun was directly overhead and the shadows were short and deceptive. Captain Rodriguez led the advance party, his experienced eyes scanning the canyon walls for signs of ambush. But the Apache had learned their craft from masters who had been perfecting it for centuries. There was nothing to see except rock and sky and the endless blue dome of the desert heaven. The killing began when the main body of riders was strung out along the canyon floor, unable to retreat or advance quickly, trapped like cattle in a slaughterhouse. Ember's first shot took Rodriguez through the chest, spinning him from his saddle and sending his horse plunging in panic. Before the echo of the gunshot had faded, Dahana's arrow found its mark in the throat of a sergeant who had been trying to organize a defense. What followed was not a battle but a systematic slaughter. The colonel's men were brave and well-trained, but they were fighting an enemy who knew every stone and shadow of the terrain, who could appear and disappear like smoke, who struck from directions that seemed impossible and vanished before effective. Return fire could be organized. Ember moved along the canyon rim like a hunting cat, her rifle speaking death with mechanical precision. She had learned to shoot and move, to never fire twice from the same position, to use the terrain to her advantage in ways that would have impressed the most skilled military sniper. Each shot was carefully aimed and perfectly timed, designed Not just to kill, but to create maximum panic and confusion among the survivors. Colonel Brennan watched his carefully assembled force disintegrate, with the cold fury of a man who had never experienced defeat. He had brought 53 of the most dangerous men in the Southwest, armed them with the best weapons money could buy, and promised them rewards that would make them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. Yet now they were dying like sheep in a slaughterhouse, cut down by an enemy they couldn't even see. Fall back! He screamed over the gunfire, his voice cracking with strain and rage. Retreat to the canyon entrance, form a defensive perimeter. But retreat was easier ordered than accomplished. The narrow canyon that had seemed like a simple passage through the desert had become a killing ground where every step forward brought death from above, and every step backward led only to more death. The horses were plunging in panic, their riders fighting to maintain control while arrows and bullets rained down from the canyon walls. A young gunfighter named Billy Cortez, who had killed 7 men in stand-up fights and believed himself invincible, took an arrow through the eye and tumbled from his horse without a sound. An ex-cavalry sergeant named Murphy, who had survived Gettysburg and a dozen Indian campaigns, died with Ember's bullet in his brain before he could even raise his rifle. One by one, the colonel's army was being reduced to corpses and screaming horses. There! One of the surviving men pointed toward a shadow on the north wall where Ember had been careless enough to expose herself for a split second. "I saw movement. She's up there." A concentrated volley of rifle fire struck the rocks where Ember had been, sending fragments of stone spinning through the air and filling the canyon with the thunder of gunshots. But when the smoke cleared, there was nothing to see except empty rock and the mocking laughter of a woman who had learned to dance with death itself. "You missed," Ember's voice echoed from the canyon walls, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "But I won't." Her next shot took the man who had spotted her through the heart, and his body toppled from his horse to join the growing collection of corpses on the canyon floor. The psychological effect was devastating, turning brave men into cowering shadows who jumped at every sound and saw enemies in every shadow. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of blood and gold, Colonel Brennan realized that his grand expedition had become a disaster of epic proportions. Of the 53 men who had ridden into Devil's Throat, fewer than 20 remained alive, and most of those were wounded or demoralized beyond effective fighting capability. "Elena!" He screamed toward the canyon walls, his voice raw with fury and desperation. "I know you can hear me. This is madness. You were mine. You belong to me. You have no right to rebel against your rightful owner." The only answer was the whisper of wind through the rocks and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the carnage. But then, from somewhere in the shadows above, came a voice that was familiar yet utterly transformed, carrying notes of steel and fire that would have been impossible in the woman he had once owned. "Elena is dead," Ember called back, her voice echoing off the canyon walls like the pronouncement of a judge passing sentence. "She died in chains, mourned by no one, remembered by no one. But from her ashes rose something you never expected, something you cannot own or control or destroy. You're just a woman." Brennan shouted back, his voice cracking with hysteria. "A piece of property that has forgotten its place. I'll drag you back to Santa Fe in chains. I'll make you beg for the privilege of serving me. Then come and take me." Ember's voice carried a note of deadly amusement. "Climb these walls, Colonel. Face me like a man instead of hiding behind your hired killers. Show me the courage that earned you your rank and your reputation." The challenge hung in the air like a physical presence, impossible to ignore or dismiss. The surviving members of Brennan's force looked at their leader with expressions that mixed hope and skepticism, waiting to see if he would accept the challenge or order another futile assault on the canyon walls. What happened next would be remembered in Apache legend for generations to come. Colonel Marcus Brennan, driven by a pride that had been wounded beyond endurance, actually accepted Ember's challenge. He dismounted from his horse, checked his weapons, and began the treacherous climb up the canyon wall toward the position where he believed his rebellious property was waiting. The climb was brutal, made more difficult by the loose rock and the constant threat of falling to his death on the canyon floor below. But Brennan had been a soldier for 20 years, and he had not achieved his rank through cowardice or weakness. He climbed with the grim determination of a man who would rather die than admit defeat. Ember watched his progress from her concealed position, her rifle trained on his struggling form, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. She could have killed him a dozen times during his ascent, but that would have been too easy too quick. This man who had stolen 3 years of her life, who had treated her like a possession to be displayed and discarded at will, deserved something more personal than a bullet from ambush. When Brennan finally reached the ledge where she was waiting, he found himself facing a woman who bore no resemblance to the frightened girl he had married 4 years earlier. Ember stood before him in full Apache war paint, her auburn hair braided with feathers and bones, her amber eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to burn from within. She held a knife in each hand, the blades gleaming like captured starlight. "You wanted to collect beautiful things," she said, her voice carrying the deadly calm of a predator about to strike. "Let me show you how beautiful death can be." The fight that followed was brief but vicious, a collision of two worlds that could never coexist peacefully. Brennan fought with the desperate fury of a man who had everything to lose, while Ember fought with the cold precision of someone who had already lost everything and been reborn from the ashes of her former life. In the end, it was no contest. The colonel's military training and superior size meant nothing against an enemy who had learned to fight like an Apache warrior, who moved with the fluid grace of desert wind and struck with the pitiless efficiency of a rattlesnake. Ember's blades found their marks with surgical precision, and Colonel Marcus Brennan died as he had lived, trying to take something that was never his to claim. As the sun set over Devil's Throat, painting the canyon walls in shades of crimson and gold, Ember and Diana stood among the bodies of their enemies and surveyed the results of their work. The desert had indeed remembered every drop of blood that had been spilled on its soil, and now it would remember 53 more. "It's finished," Ember said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that was both beautiful and terrible. "The colonel is dead, his army is destroyed, and the message has been sent to anyone else who might think to hunt us." "What message is that?" the Hana asked, though he already knew the answer. "That some things cannot be owned, some spirits cannot be caged, and some fires burn too bright to be extinguished by mortal hands." Ember looked out over the vast expanse of desert that stretched to the horizon, her amber eyes reflecting the dying light. "We are free, Dahana. Truly free, for the first time in either of our lives." But even as she spoke the words, both of them knew that freedom was never permanent, that other hunters would come, that other challenges would arise. The desert was vast and beautiful and dangerous, and it would always be home to those who were strong enough to claim it and wise enough to respect its power. Together, they walked away from Devil's Throat, leaving the dead to the scavengers and the elements, carrying with them the knowledge that they had become something new under the desert sun, something that belonged neither to the world of civilization nor to the world of the wilderness, but to the eternal spaces between, where only the truly free could walk. 2 years had passed since the massacre at Devil's Throat, and the story of the desert ghost and the fire woman had spread across the southwest like wildfire, growing with each telling until it became something more than history, something approaching myth. In cantinas from El Paso to Los Angeles, travelers spoke in hushed tones of the Apache warrior who could walk between worlds and the woman who had risen from chains to become a force of nature herself. But the subjects of these legends had found something more precious than fame or fear. They had found peace, hidden in a valley that existed on no map, sheltered by mountains that seemed to touch the sky itself. Dahana and Ember had built a life that neither had dared to dream possible. In their darker days, the valley was a miracle of nature, fed by underground springs that kept it green even in the driest seasons, home to deer and elk and wild horses that had never known the touch of human hands. The Apache call this place Shinasha, Dahana, explained as they stood together on the ridge overlooking their hidden paradise. It means place where the earth dreams. My grandfather brought me here when I was 12 to teach me about the sacred places that must be protected at all costs. Ember nodded, her amber eyes taking in the vista of green meadows and crystal streams that seemed impossible in the heart of the desert. She had learned enough Apache over the past 2 years to understand that some places were more than mere geography, that they were touchstones to something deeper and more eternal than the struggles of mortal beings. It's beautiful, she said. Simply, but the words carried depths of meaning that went beyond mere aesthetic appreciation. This was the first place in her adult life where she had felt truly safe, truly free, truly at home. Here, she was not Alina Vasquez the victim or Ember the warrior, but simply a woman who had found her place in the world and the man who shared it with her. Below them, in the valley's heart, stood the house they had built together over the course of 18 months. It was constructed in the old Apache way, with walls of stone and adobe that would stand for centuries, timber beams cut from trees that had been blessed by the tribal elders, and a roof that opened to the sky so that the spirits of their ancestors could visit freely. The most remarkable change in their lives had come 6 months earlier, when word began to spread through the underground networks of escaped slaves, runaway wives, and displaced Indians that there was a place where the broken could find healing, where the hunted could find safety, where those who had lost everything could find a new beginning. The first to arrive had been Maria Santos, a Mexican woman who had fled from a brothel in Tucson with her infant daughter. She had been traveling for weeks, living on cactus fruit and rainwater, when she collapsed at the entrance to their valley. Ember had found her there, more dead than alive, and had nursed her back to health with the same patience and skill that Dahana had once shown to her. "Why do you help me?" Maria had asked when she was strong enough to speak. "You don't know me. You owe me nothing." "Because someone once helped me when I had nothing," Ember had replied simply. "And because the desert is vast enough for all of us to find our place in it." Maria had stayed, becoming the first member of what would eventually grow into a small community of refugees and outcasts who had found their way to the valley through various means. There was Running Bear, an elderly Apache medicine man who had escaped from a reservation and brought with him the knowledge of the old ways. There was Thomas Mitchell, a former slave who had fought his way to freedom and now served as the valley's blacksmith and gunsmith. "We're building something here," Ember said to Dahana as they watched the children play in the stream that ran through the valley's center. "Something that the world has never seen before. A place where people are valued for who they are, not what they can be forced to become. A place where the chains exist only in memory." Dahana agreed. "Where the coyotes howl not from loneliness, but from joy." The ceremony took place on a warm spring evening when the valley was filled with the scent of wildflowers and the sound of running water. It was not a wedding in the traditional sense, for Apache culture did not recognize the same legal bonds that governed white society, but rather a joining of spirits that would bind them not just in this life, but in all the lives that were to come. Running Bear had prepared them according to the ancient customs, painting their faces with sacred symbols and blessing them with smoke from burning sage and sweetgrass. The entire community had gathered in the meadow beside the stream, forming a circle around the couple as they spoke their vows in both English and Apache, their voices carrying across the valley like music. "I was a man walking in shadows," Dahana said, his dark eyes reflecting the light of the ceremonial fire. "I was a spirit lost between worlds, neither fully alive nor completely dead. But you brought me back to the light, Ember of the burning heart. You taught me that the greatest courage is not in facing death, but in choosing to live. I was a woman in chains, Ember replied, her voice strong and clear. I was a bird in a cage, a fire reduced to embers, a song that had forgotten its melody, but you gave me wings, Dahana of the walking spirit. You showed me that freedom is not something that can be given or taken, but something that must be claimed and defended with every breath. They exchanged rings carved from desert stone, simple bands that would serve as permanent reminders of the vows they had made and the journey that had brought them together. As the ceremony concluded and the community began to celebrate with drums and dancing, both of them understood that they had become something larger than the sum of their individual parts. But peace, like freedom, was something that had to be constantly defended. Word of the valley's existence had begun to spread beyond the network of refugees and outcasts, attracting the attention of those who saw opportunity in the suffering of others. The threat came in the form of Captain James Morrison, a career cavalry officer who had made his reputation hunting Apache bands and had recently been given a new assignment to locate and destroy what the Army was calling the Renegade Settlement. Morrison was everything that Colonel Brennan had not been: patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless in his pursuit of what he considered military objectives. He had spent months gathering intelligence about the valley's location, its defenses, and its inhabitants. Unlike Brennan, who had been driven by personal obsession, Morrison was motivated by professional duty and the promise of promotion that would come with successful completion of his mission. "They're coming," Thomas Mitchell reported as he rode into the valley after a scouting mission to the surrounding mountains. Full cavalry company, maybe 80 men, with howitzers and supply wagons. "They're not planning to capture anyone this time. They're planning to wipe us out completely." The news sent a chill through the community that had nothing to do with the desert night. These were not bounty hunters or hired guns who might be bought off or frightened away, but United States soldiers acting under official orders. There would be no negotiation, no mercy, no possibility of peaceful resolution. "We have to evacuate," Maria Santos said, her voice tight with fear for her daughter's safety. "Take the children and the elderly and disappear into the deep desert. Let them have the valley if they want it so badly." "No," Ember said firmly, her amber eyes blazing with a determination that reminded everyone present of the legends they had heard about the Fire Woman. "We've run far enough. We've given up. Enough. This is our home now, and we'll defend it like one." The battle for the valley began at dawn on a day that would be remembered in Apache oral tradition for generations to come. Morrison's cavalry had approached during the night, surrounding the valley's entrances and positioning their artillery on the ridges overlooking the settlement. Their plan was simple and brutal: bombard the community into submission, then sweep through the ruins to eliminate any survivors. But the defenders were not the helpless refugees that Morrison had expected to find. Under Dahana's leadership, they had spent months preparing for exactly this type of assault, creating hidden positions, stockpiling weapons and ammunition, and training even the women and older children in the arts of desert warfare. "Remember," Dahana told the assembled defenders as they took their positions in the pre-dawn darkness, "we are not fighting for conquest or glory. We are fighting for the right to exist, for the right to raise our children in freedom, for the right to exist, for the right to exist. Right to live and die as human beings rather than as property." The first artillery shells began falling at sunrise, their explosions sending geysers of earth and stone into the air and filling the valley with the thunder of war. But the defenders had learned their lessons well, and most of the community's buildings had been constructed with reinforced cellars and protective walls that could withstand all but direct hits. Ember led a group of the younger fighters in a series of lightning raids against the artillery positions, using their knowledge of the mountain terrain to approach unseen and strike with devastating effect. She moved through the battle like a force of nature, her rifle speaking death with mechanical precision, her presence on the battlefield inspiring the other defenders to acts of heroism that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. As the day wore on, it became clear that the defenders were fighting a losing battle. Morrison's forces were too numerous, too well-equipped, too professionally trained to be defeated by a handful of refugees and outcasts, no matter how courageously they fought. The artillery bombardment had destroyed most of the settlements, buildings, and the cavalry charges had pushed the defenders back to their final positions around the sacred spring that fed the valley. "We can't hold them much longer," Thomas Mitchell reported during a brief lull in the fighting. Blood was streaming from a head wound, and his left arm hung useless at his side. "They'll overrun us with the next charge." Dahana looked around at the faces of the people who had become his family, his tribe, his reason for living. They were battered and exhausted, but their eyes still held the fire of defiance that had brought them to this place. These were people who had chosen freedom over safety, who had risked everything for the chance to live as human beings rather than as victims. "Then we make our stand here," he said quietly. "At the spring where life begins, where the earth dreams, where the spirits of our ancestors watch over us. If we must die, we die as free people defending our home." But Ember had other plans. While the others prepared for the final assault, she slipped away from the defensive positions and made her way to the ammunition cache they had hidden in the caves above the spring. Her face was set in lines of grim determination as she worked to prepare the charges that would bring down half the mountain on top of Morrison's forces. "Where are you going?" Dahana called out when he discovered her absence and tracked her to the cave entrance. "To end this," she said simply. "To make sure that no one else has to die for the crime of wanting to be free." The explosion that followed could be heard for 50 miles in all directions, a sound like the earth itself screaming in rage and pain. The entire eastern face of the mountain collapsed in a thunderous avalanche of rock and debris, burying Morrison's artillery positions and most of his cavalry under millions of tons of stone. The few survivors fled in terror, carrying with them stories of a battle that had ended not in defeat, but in something approaching divine intervention. When the dust finally settled, Dahana found Ember buried under the rubble at the cave mouth. Her body broken, but her spirit undefeated. She had stayed behind to ensure that the charges detonated properly, sacrificing herself to save the community that had become her family. "Did we win?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the settling debris. "We won," Dahana said, cradling her in his arms as the life slowly left her amber eyes. "We won because we never surrendered, never gave up, never stopped fighting for what was right." "Good," she said, and smiled one last time. "Then it was worth it. All of it. Every moment of pain, every tear, every drop of blood. It was all worth it." They buried Ember beside the sacred spring, in a grave marked not with a stone, but with a circle of desert, wildflowers that bloomed year-round regardless of season or weather. The valley was rebuilt, stronger than before, and it became a beacon of hope for outcasts and refugees from across the Southwest. The community grew and prospered, guided by the principles that Dahana and Ember had established, that every person had the right to freedom, that strength came from standing together, and that some things were worth dying for. Dahana lived for many more years, serving as the valley's guardian and protector, teaching the children the ways of the desert and the lessons of survival. He never remarried, never forgot the woman who had brought him back from the shadow realm, never stopped believing that somewhere in the vast expanse of the desert, her spirit still walked free. In the evenings when the coyotes began their mournful chorus and the stars appeared in the darkening sky, the children would gather around the fire and ask him to tell them the story of the firewoman, the lady who had been chained where the coyotes howled and who had whispered her true name in the darkness. "Once upon a time," Dahana would begin, his voice carrying across the valley like music, "there was a lonely Apache who found a woman chained where the coyotes howled. But she was not just any woman, and he was not just any man. They were two souls who had been broken by the world and remade by their own courage. two spirits who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk toward the light together, and in the retelling, their story became more than history, more than memory, more than legend. It became a promise that somewhere in the vast desert, freedom still existed for those brave enough to claim it, that love could conquer even the deepest darkness, and that the human spirit, once truly awakened, could never again be chained. The desert remembered, as it always remembered, and the coyotes sang their eternal song, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the story lived on, forever and always, in the hearts of those who understood that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Not that they had defeated their enemies, but that they had become something larger than their own pain, something that would inspire others long after their mortal forms had returned to the dust from which they came. They had become legend, and legends never die.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.